So we're getting 11 new legendary spells in Festival of Legends, and I wanted to rank them from worst to best. Kicking it off here with, no surprise, Warrior in the bottom spot. I think Black Rock and Roll is going to be the worst of the new legendary spells. It's going to give all minions in your deck attack and health equal to their cost. So sometimes a pretty substantial buff there. The problem with this card, though, for me, is the delay. It's like just stacking delay after delay after delay on top of each other. For instance, you got to spend 5 mana up front. Okay, that's a big pass on a 5 mana turn, for instance. Then you've got to actually draw into these buffed cards, and you're going to want a handful of them to make it feel worth it, right? So you might need to draw 2, 3, 4 things before this really starts to pay dividends. But even then, you've got to put those cards into play, so you've got to spend additional mana to get those into play, and then they maybe need a turn to attack. Of course, you can get some rush and taunt and stuff to accelerate that a little bit, but still, ultimately, you've got all of these stacking delays. And at the end of the day, it's just stats, and they're so easily dealt with sometimes. Just, oh man, the opponent had a Soul Stealer. I did all this work, and my stats are dead. So, like, yeah, I guess you could have some cool charge combos or something, but that just feels really iffy, particularly because this is a one-of in your deck. So if you don't hit this on time, the whole deck kind of falls apart. And we've seen this model multiple times in the past, maybe dating back to, what, like Lady in White and the Witchwood? There may be even older examples than that. That never really worked. Then we had Lorthamar Throne as recently as last expansion, and that didn't seem to go anywhere. And I don't really think Black Rock and Roll does it any better than those cards. And in fact, the fact that there's no stats on this and it's just a spell, it might even do it a little bit worse. So this is a card with a pretty terrible precedent behind it, and I don't see it changing anything here at all. Black Rock and Roll feels like a pretty darn weak legendary spell, and for me, it's going to be the worst of the expansion. So next up here at the number 10 spot, or the second worst legendary spell of the expansion, I'm going to put in Stranglethorn Heart, which is fitting because it's a 10 mana spell. It's going to resurrect all friendly beasts that cost 5 or more, and that is a really big effect, of course, if you got a giant board of giant stuff. That's exciting. But in reality, when I look at this card, I have to think about the context. Like, is the deck going to be there to support this? Are you going to be able to play a big beast hunter? And then secondarily, is the game state going to be there to support this? In other words, if you've successfully made it to turn 10 as a big beast hunter, have you kind of turned the corner already? Is it, if you made it that far because your opponent was slow enough and you've managed to stick some awesome big beasts? I can't imagine a really close back and forth game in something like a Big Beast Hunter where Stranglethorn Heart really is what changes the course of the game. I think you'll often have already lost, or often will be well on your way to winning, because as soon as you stick a big Banjosaur or something in its hitting face, you're probably not going to need a card like Stranglethorn Heart, and your deck might be better off having utilized some other support piece, some other enabler, some other early game card to help you get there and stabilize. So in other words, this might just be overkill when you've already got a bunch of big threats, if you're playing the big threats in order to, enable the Stranglethorn Heart's success in the first place. So perhaps redundant and not necessarily in a good way. It does help for a card like this to have tradable so that it's not like stuck in your hand and dead, but I don't think that's an upside so much as kind of a hedge against a lot of this card's weaknesses. So I don't know, I just have trouble seeing this deck coming together in a way where Stranglethorn Heart feels good. I don't really think the deck's going to get there anyway, but if it does, is Stranglethorn Heart really going to be that helpful or that important as far as the deck is concerned? For me, no, but you know, it's big enough that if more cool beasts come along later, it could find a home eventually. I'm curious if you guys like this card a little bit more than I do. Next up here, we've got Mage's legendary spell, Infinitize the Maxitude. And this is an infinite value generating card, because if you actually do hit this with Finale, then you're going to keep getting another Infinitize the Maxitude, which basically means every turn you can spend 2 mana to discover a spell. And it is nice discovering things. We know discover's a good keyword, but the structure of this card, I think, creates some limitations that make me really nervous about it, and that's why it's merely at my number 9 spot. And that's because really the reason we like to discover things is to find good answers in the moment. We want to start a turn by discovering something and finding a card that's really great right now. And it handles this board, it's removal, it's a threat, whatever we need in that specific game scenario. Discover can help us find something that's typically fairly well aligned with our goals. Whereas with Infinitize the Maxitude, because you want to hit this on finale, you're going to be doing it at the end of your turn, which means you don't necessarily know what you need. What am I going to need next turn? What's the opponent going to do? Are they going to hit me in the face? Are they going to play threats? Do I need removal? Do I need life gain? Do I need a threat of my own because they didn't do much? It's a little bit harder sometimes to guess those scenarios, and you may not pick cards that are particularly useful, particularly over a long-term time scale if you're kind of stacking up these over multiple turns. And then on top of that, you're just kind of taking this 2 mana off the top of every turn, or really off the bottom of every turn. But it's this 2 mana overhead over and over again that I don't know how often it's going to be worth it. In other words, there might be a lot of turns where you just can't Infinitize the Maxitude because you need to do other things. You got to put cards into play, and it's just kind of sitting there chilling in hand, and it's like, yeah, this isn't really doing a lot for me. And then you finally come to a point where you need something right now, you need an answer, you need a board clear, and then you just have to play it at the start of your turn anyway. So it's just kind of sitting there dead, and it could have been, this is a bad example because it's rotating, but what if it was just a Ruined Orb instead, and you would have much rather had a Ruined Orb in that scenario? So in other words, the fact that this card can go infinite, and as cool as that is, in order to utilize that benefit, you have to kind of accept a lot of downsides with this card as well. So in other words, I don't know if mages are going to be all that excited to do that. So I think a lot of the times this is going to feel kind of clunky and stuck and dead, as opposed to being this really awesome long-term enabler. Not to mention, how many games do we have in Hearthstone where they're going enough turns that a card like this really pays off over time? I don't know. Usually games go much faster these days. In a fresh 4-set meta like this one, there's more of a chance for Infinitize the Maxitude, so maybe this gets a little bit of play early, but then I think probably rapidly falls off as the game accelerates and becomes more lethal throughout the course of a standard format year. So maybe a little bit of hope on this one up front very early, but then not much hope for me. So moving on over to Druid here with Rhythm and Roots. This card I had some questions about from a design standpoint. I wasn't all that excited about the secretly aspect, as I talked about in my review. And ultimately, the two differences between these choices here don't feel that significant to me. It's just a delay for a little bit of extra stats, which I can't say is all that is exciting from a decision point standpoint. And I think most of the time people are just going to pick the 3/5/5s. And I think those 3/5/5s are going to be okay. On a delay, it's not great, but at least you're getting some minions down. There are some spells and things for Druid too that can help give those minions taunts or stack up a bunch of 5/5s all at once with some of the stuff like the Timber Tambourine, the new weapon. So I wouldn't be totally shocked if a slower Druid deck was able to kind of weave this in and just occasionally get some 5/5s. If they're working with a bunch of spare mana, or alternatively a bunch of spare armor so they have some survivability, they can tank a little bit of the slowness with a card like this one, but at least it's getting the bodies into play, unlike something like the Warrior spell, which you spend 5 mana on that and then you got to spend way more mana to get any sort of benefit out of it. This is at least dumping the minions in. So I don't know. I don't think this is going to be a great card, but I wouldn't be totally shocked if a slower Druid managed to make room for this, since it's only a 1/of. It's not going to feel like the star of the deck. It's not going to feel super important or game deciding or anything, but it might feel just okay. So moving on over to Paladin, I think we're at the number 7 spot at this stage. This is where the cards start to get a little bit more exciting for me. I think these look more playable, more interesting. These are cards I expect to see more often in play. And of course, by the time I get to number 1, I think they're going to be amazing. But this is Starlight Groove. This is the one that gives your hero Divine Shield, and then you can keep refreshing it if you play a holy spell. And that's a cool little effect. The fact that it lasts for the rest of the game. You might be able to get quite a few Divine Shields out of this, which in some matchups could definitely deny your opponent the ability to deal significant damage. If they have like a lot of small chip damage, they're not going to care much about your Divine Shield. But if they're planning to hit you with 5/5s and 8/8s and stuff, then yeah, this could actually be a really significant life gain over the course of an entire game. I don't think it's going to be as good as something like the Cariel weapon, but also it's only 3 mana, so you just set it up, and hopefully your game plan is refreshing those Divine Shields pretty organically. I don't think you have to go out of your way necessarily to play holy spells. Paladin does have a bunch. So I do think this will find play in more defensive, control-oriented Paladin decks. It's probably going to feel a bit like a freebie just to toss in. I do not think this is going to be played, though, in more aggressive Divine Shield Paladin decks. I think they'll have plenty of ways to play for Divine Shield synergies and things like converting a Divine Shield into a 5/5 like we saw with the new 2-mana spell. I don't think you're going to need Starlight Groove for that. I think you're going to be happy to just use more aggressive minion-based strategies, and this will be reserved more for the defensive paladins, which, you know, are, I think, number one, a little less likely to get played significantly and probably less likely to be powerful decks, because we already know Divine Shield Pure Paladin's pretty good and not losing much. So, you know, this is one of those cards I think is going to be fine. It's just not going to be the go-to way to play Paladin, I would say, especially right away with this new expansion. So solid, just not at the forefront of the class strengths right now. So next up here at the number 6 spot, we've got Demon Hunters Going Down Swinging, a song reference I totally didn't have to look up. No, I did recognize it once I looked it up, of course, but at first I was like, what is everybody talking about? What's going down swinging? What's that mean? I got it though. Don't worry. This, of course, a 5-mana spell. It's going to give your hero +2 attack and immune this turn, then attack each enemy minion. So yeah, I think this will be a pretty reasonable board clear option for various Demon Hunters. One you could even run in a deck that's looking to be a little bit more aggressive, because this can still allow you to attack and stuff, but swing a board basically in your favor, particularly an aggro board with a lot of little junk minions out there. This allows you to clean them up, maybe still hit face, push some damage, and it has some scalability too, because of the fact that you can add extra attack and clear even bigger boards. You know, I think Blade Dance did a similar thing back in the day, but did it better. I would argue it's fewer minions perhaps, but a little bit more efficient at 3 mana. I don't think this will be as powerful as Blade Dance, but still looks pretty good to me. So next up is Jive Insect, and this one's weird because if I just looked at this card in a vacuum, I guess, I don't think it would be nearly this high. I don't think getting a 5/7 mana Ragnaros is a good play. That's not a relevant good play these days. It's too slow. Ragnaros has too many targets to hit these days. I just am not excited about that. But I can't get this out of the back of my brain with Criminal lineup. I talked about this in my card review. And the various like spell discounts and stuff Shaman's getting with its new weapon, Jazz Base, I think it's called. And I'm envisioning this world where you have 5 Ragnaroses or whatever on board, and it's an OTK and it's a decent deck. So I'm giving Jive Insect here kind of a bonus, because I think there are going to be scenarios where you turn something into a Ragnaros, you cheat some mana for a spell, you cast Criminal lineup on it, and you got 5 Rags, and that's 40 damage, and the opponent is dead. Or at the very least wiped out with a lot of Ragnaroses to deal with. So I'm giving this probably a few bonus spot bumps here just on that possibility. I don't know if that's going to be good. If it's not, then this card probably really belongs at like the number 9 spot or something. But for now, I'm kind of taking a flyer here on Jive Insect and giving it some extra hope, because I think there's some OTK potential on this one that maybe I'm just curious to explore for fun more than anything else, but it has me extra hopeful for this card. Not that I maybe even want to see that. I don't know if that's something I'd welcome, but perhaps I'm just thinking about and do consider a very real possibility. So now we're moving over to the top 4, and from this point, I think all these cards are just really good and have a lot of potential. So kind of splitting hairs about who goes where, but for now, number 4 is Symphony of Sins, the new Warlock spell, all about the movements. You discover movement and then shuffle the other 6. There's a bunch of movements, of course. I guess I'll hover over these if you somehow haven't seen these yet, but I would encourage you to check my card review. But they each, of course, are 3 mana spells that have pretty powerful effects dealing with the number 6. And some of the effects feel, I think, really insane, and some feel pretty good, but maybe not amazing. That said, I think any slower Warlock is probably going to be able to afford space for Symphony of Sins. You're not super excited about the front half of the card where you're playing the first movement. Some of them in particular might be sacrificing quite a bit of tempo, may not feel like great plays on turn 6 for 6 mana. but you're setting up so well with each other one. I think they all feel so good at 3 mana when you get them in the future that it's still going to feel like the payoff is there for these cards. That little bit of disconnect between the first play and the rest is probably why I put this at number 4 as opposed to higher, because I think some matchups is going to feel really tough to get this rolling and draw into these. You know, there's some delays baked into that, as we talk about, but I think there are going to be plenty of other slower, grindier matchups where you do have time and they start to win the game so quickly once you get them that it does indeed feel worth it. So still think this is going to be a pretty darn good card, and Warlock is a class that typically can utilize these sorts of cards better than most because they have survivability and they have card draw, both of which I think this requires to look good. So pretty darn hopeful for Symphony of Sins. Also, I think it just looks super fun. So next up here is Climactic Necrotic Explosion in my top 3. And I think I like this card a little bit more than most because I think a lot of people consider the rainbow aspect of this card, the fact that it requires a single blood, frost, and unholy rune to be played. I think that's a pretty significant downside in most people's minds, because right now most of the strongest Death Knight decks we've seen are all triple rune varieties. There's been a few other things bouncing around here and there, but typically we like all 3 of those runes to explore the power of those triple rune cards. Now that said, I think this is a card that's powerful enough to encourage you to play single rune cards, much like the powerful triple rune cards have been in the past. And on top of that, I think that it's going to be easier and easier to play rainbow decks in Death Knight, especially throughout the course of the year, because right now when we started, we only had the 1 batch of Death Knight cards, so there weren't a lot of single rune cards to pick from, meaning you didn't have a lot of great choices from a power level standpoint. But we're already getting a new batch of Death Knight cards, and then there's going to be another new batch in the next expansion and another new batch in the next expansion, all of which are going to keep increasing the likelihood that a rainbow deck finds viability because you just have more good cards to choose from at various single rune stages. So at some point, when a viable rainbow deck comes together, I think this card's going to feel absolutely bonkers because it has that kind of, I don't know, Sire Denathrius sort of effect. As you can see, it's going to randomly improve by corpses spent throughout a game. So at some point, it's going to deal 20 damage maybe and summon 7 5/5 souls or something, where even if it doesn't necessarily win a game via just burst damage or the life gain from the life steal, keep that in mind as well, it's kind of a Reno, kind of an OTK, and kind of a board builder all in one, which I think means against various matchups it's going to have utility. If you're playing a grindy, greedy deck, kill them with damage. If you're playing an aggro deck where you need some life gain, that life steal, that Reno effect could be huge. You just heal enough to stabilize. If you're playing it where you need bodies, you need a board to develop, then you've got that option as well. So I don't know, man. It's a question of scaling a little bit. Is it going to be easy to get these numbers big enough? Are you going to be able to spend enough corpses? I haven't seen it in action, so that's the kind of one big question mark for me. But I think from an output standpoint and from a deck construction standpoint, I don't have any questions about this. I think it will get there on those side of things, in which case I think it'll be a really powerful payoff. So for me, I don't know. I have a lot more hope for this card than I've seen for most people. I think it's going to feel pretty good and perhaps even pretty oppressive at some point. So now heading over to the number 2 spot here, we've got Bounce Around featuring Garona, Rogue's legendary song / spell. And this is kind of a super Shadow Step, super Tinwu, I guess, of sorts. And, you know, we've seen these kind of effects for Rogue be very, very powerful in the past. I will say I'm a little bit more questioning of this one because of that 3 mana. That's a pretty big start to an effect like this. I think that pushes it pretty far into the game. You perhaps have to play some friendly minions with it first. So I actually have some question marks on this one. You know, if I were to really buckle down and like say, do I think this card's going to be good today? I would probably put it lower in this list, to be honest. I'd probably be like, I don't know, man, that's a lot of mana to start all this out. I'm not so sure I see it coming together. And I would maybe put this card around like the 7 spot or something. But here's the deal, right? I know Rogue, and Rogue has just done so many gross, busted things with cards like this in the past. And these bounce effects and mana cheat with stuff like preparations makes this 1 mana. And then it's like, okay, well, it's already easier to solve all these problems, right? We got Shadow Steps to go with this. I just have this instinct that says this is going to end up broken at some point. Like, I don't really see it right now. It looks kind of clunky and expensive comparative to some of these other effects, but I know Rogue cheats. Rogue's gonna do something to make this card insane, so I better respect that precedent. I better respect that history for the class, and therefore I'm putting Bounce Around at the number 2 spot. So that said, for the number 1 spot here, I actually picked Priest and Love Everlasting, which, listen, I don't think this is going to have the flashiness of the last few cards or the kind of like dramatic game-ending nature of the last few cards. Its sort of power spike nature is lower than those. Those are kind of game-ending and crazy and build around and like do really big significant things. But for the number 1 spot here, I picked a card that I think is going to be reliable and like consistent and proven, and like I think priests are going to play this a lot and play it all the time, and I think it's going to be in like all slower priest decks for the next 2 years, right? Whereas those cards may come in and out of fashion, they may be flashy and big every once in a while. I feel like this is just going to work for a long time because this is really, really reliable cost reduction. And we know that cost reduction in Hearthstone is a very powerful effect. So spend 3 mana and potentially get, a preparation effect basically for the rest of the game. That is something I think Priest is really going to love, particularly being able to cheat out some big spells early, weave in extra cards, extra removal, all these things that Priest loves. I think Love Everlasting is going to be there. Plus, I think there's like combo potential for this card as well, basically giving you kind of 12 mana at any given turn with spells. There might be some combo setup, some lethal stuff comes out of this later because you have Love Everlasting there to set it up. So for me, this was like a safe pick, I guess. Like, I just think this is gonna work. For me, this just makes too much sense not to work. Maybe not as flashy, maybe not as exciting, but like proven, reliable, consistent. That's what I see for this card, and that's why it's my number 1. So that said, I'm curious about your rankings. Where would you put all the various legendary spells? Where does Love Everlasting belong? Is Bounce Around an easy number 1 for you? Is something near the bottom of my list actually near the top of your list? I want to hear all those thoughts and more down in the comments below. I also want to say stay tuned for the legendary musician rankings. I'm going to have those coming up soon. We'll talk about all the various legendary minions for the classes. And then finally, I think we'll just do an overall 10 best cards for Festival of Legends. So locking in a bunch of fun predictions this week before we get to play all these cards. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.